This podcast is for teachers and educators that want to better understand what racial equity is, get strategies on how to create a culturally responsive learning environment, and learn how racial equity improves outcomes for students, particularly students of color.
Welcome to another episode of #RUJCPS. Today we have the Equity Inclusion Resource Team. Today we ask the question, are you teaching students to be globally and culturally competent? Or even, how are you teaching students to be globally and culturally competent? Here in JCPS, we have committed to preparing students for a successful transition to their next phase in life by focusing on success skills that are carried throughout their K-12 career. Educators are working to make sure students are effective communicators, prepared and resilient learners, productive collaborators, emerging innovators, and globally and culturally competent citizens.
So, to me, when globally and culturally competent citizen comes up, what I think about is our students and just their daily lives. So, are we making sure that they are exposed to things that are happening in the world, to things that are happening in their city, and are they able to really speak to those things? To me, that's how we can build a relationship with people that may be far from us, by finding some of those commonalities and the way that things are happening and rolling out in their neighborhood or their city or their world. Are they aware of those things, and do they have a voice to question what is happening, to learn more about what is happening, to see how they can make a change?
And I think, Lamanda, the most powerful word in that statement is the understanding that students are aware of the issues and how they affect them close to home, because I think that's the difference between like a authentic application of that global and cultural competency as opposed to, again, just global and cultural competency being a buzzword. There's a difference in understanding that pollution exists, and then there's a difference in understanding that pollution exists and affects brown and black learners. I'm a brown and black learner, that we have disproportionate health issues because of the pollution that exists in urban areas. There's a difference. And it's about that learner understanding where their identity is fitting in into the like global and local landscape.
When I hear about competence, to me that sounds like an ability to look at a situation, a culture, a region, a global issue, and knowing and being able to apply what you've learned about others and in your core content classes, and finding a way to really expand that into true competence. I can look at this situation and understand it from a multitude of perspectives.
You all hit a lot of the key points that JCPS has identified as part of this backpack skill. So we have performance outcomes for 5th graders, 8th grade, and 12th grade students. As we all know, students will be participating in backpack defenses. So I was just going to highlight some of the language from these performance outcomes. If you're looking at 5th grade, that the student can identify positive language about my own and others' identities and lived experiences. And then by the time they're in 12th grade, they can analyze how my own and others' identities and lived experiences, perspectives, interactions, language, and understanding of situation, events, issues, or a phenomena, how they relate together. And then also, students in elementary are starting out looking at issues that are important to their community, and by 12th grade are able to analyze the root causes and come up with a response to the things that are affecting their communities. And then also we have students being able, by the time they graduate 12th grade, to analyze the ethics of law, civic action, and behavior, and demonstrate behaviors that promote a sense of belonging and community across difference in various settings and interactions. So a lot of the things that you brought out when you think of global and cultural competence are exactly where we're trying to go in JCPS. Cultural competence represents one of the many ways the racial equity pillar and the backpack of success skills support each other. The racial equity policy calls for the district to develop rich curriculum resources that accurately include contributions of people of color and their impact on society, as well as provide students with ongoing opportunities to understand racial identity and its impact. When teachers are skilled in applying an equity lens to their work, the students, their identities, their families, and communities become a source for curriculum. There are teachers and teams around the district who value diversity and understand the importance of being culturally responsive to improving engagement and outcomes for students of color as well as white students. Let's take a look at a few examples. The first example that I found was from Slaughter Elementary. Shout out to Slaughter and their second grade team. They designed a whole unit on identity. And so I wanted to look at this unit and think about what are some steps we see towards this success skill in this identity unit. It's designed for second grade.
Just looking at the example from Slaughter, one thing that I think is important to point out is the fact that the cultural and global competence is not treated as the other. It's not treated as an addition. It's embedded throughout so that it's comprehensive, so that by the end of the unit, students are able to answer these essential questions that, again, are really just fostering these students and growing towards becoming more culturally and globally competent citizens.
One of the things I notice is they have a PBL end of unit project where they create an artifact representing their identity and then share it in an identity museum with parents and staff and classmates, which is involving the community, which also gives different perspectives.
So something else that I see in this unit are what make up the units. It's the essential questions. So as educators, when we're thinking about how are we going to bring up the topic of equity in our classrooms, how are we going to be able to have these conversations if we feel like there's maybe no room in the regular curriculum to do that? What we're going to need to do is look at our essential questions and how we are teaching our students. And so their essential questions deal with identity. And if you're aware of Teach Intolerance, they have resources that can help you think about some of those essential questions. So even going back to our performance skills for backpack, if we are talking about community and how students can contextualize and see themselves in the community, let's think about some of those essential questions. So an example could be, how do we each take responsibility for our community? So that could be something even under identity. And I'm speaking of the 4 topics from Teach Intolerance: identity, diversity, justice, and action. And so we can find an essential question or a lot of essential questions for each of those topics. Under diversity, it could be, how do people in different jobs in past and present influence the way we live? That still connects directly back to our community. From the justice perspectives, why have people not been able to get the jobs they've wanted? That still ties into community. And then lastly, under action, how can we allocate classroom jobs to make sure everyone is treated fairly? Still, the classroom community.
What I think stands out about this unit, in addition to the other things my colleagues brought up, is that the teacher is making a point to establish what he or she has called critical vocabulary, including terms such as diversity, identity, religion, traits, and stereotypes. We need to, of course, help our students become familiar with using content-rich vocabulary, but they also need to be able to navigate that content with vocab that allows them to peel apart inequities, to discuss identity, and to use these terms with finesse so that they will continue to use them and grow their cultural and global competence as they move forward, as they grow in their learning careers.
My definite favorite part of this unit is the text selection that they're using. Thunderboy Jr., My Hair is a Garden, Deep in the Sahara. And so they're being very intentional about the books that are chosen, and how they connect to identity. Going home to Ecuador. So this is a news article from ELA. So they're looking for specific texts that relate to their students and helping them to understand identity. We have more good examples across the district. We saw one from a middle school ELA example from Ramsey. So thank you, Ramsey, for sharing with us. This was a unit around judgment where students are given the opportunity to represent how society sees them and how they see themselves. In this unit, kids explore, confront, and disrupt stereotypes that are based on snap judgments. Again, the essential question here was really important and drove the unit. Why do we judge others? Throughout the unit, the students examine their own identity and explore ways in which they might be judged for how people see them. Take a minute to click on this identity box activity.
So first, I commend Ramsey for doing this activity. I think it looks great. And so as an elementary person, I'm being a little stingy and seeing how we can use this with, our elementary babies. And so it also takes me back to that backpack of skills and how they have to do some defenses. And in this activity where the students are, they're writing, they could be drawing about themselves, whatever their identity box is. I think this would be great to have further conversation when we talk about building relationships with our students. This is a great way to learn more about our learners. How can we take the information that we know from this and then also apply it back in our classroom so that we are helping to meet the needs of more of our students?
This step 2 to me is really powerful because it asks students to basically they have two identities, what the outside world thinks of them as well as an internal identity or the traits that they ascribe to themselves. That's real powerful because that lets them know that there are two identities that they need to be aware of and think through. And then the second thing, I'm like Lamanda, I start thinking from a science and a math standpoint. What is your identity with those regards, like with STEAM? How does the outside world see you? What do you see as yourself, and what are your strengths?
What I do enjoy about this opportunity to examine one's identity, both internally and how others see you, is that there's a lot of freedom to explore oneself and then present those findings in a multitude of ways. And it is so critical to give our kids ways to be assessed in a manner that works for them. And so there's so many cross-curricular chances here to be artistic, to draw upon history, to draw upon family history and experiences, and really represent themselves in a way that is tailored to who they are while still maintaining high academic standards.
I think this is pretty good, but I also am thinking identity box. Just the term box to me sends a message of what we have created in a lot of classrooms are these boxes, and that I feel like sometimes students feel boxed in and having to have the idea of that however they identify may not be respected, even though this activity is supposed to actually encourage a type of outside of the box and inside of the box kind of identity, but just a whole fact of that there is even a box.
I really agree with that too, and I feel like this is an opportunity for them to discuss that really, and for students to have that voice about how society sees them, and then an opportunity for the teachers to capitalize on helping students understand the history of racism and oppression in our country, and not help them not internalize those outside voices that put them in that box.
And I agree with both of you ladies. I don't want us to get stuck on a box, and so I also think this is where teacher efficacy comes in, to where we're thinking about these things before we introduce this topic and how maybe we can work on some of those things on the front end. But I agree, not to box them in. But also, I do think it is a great opportunity, yes, for the larger context and to talk about things beyond our classroom, but then this is a great opportunity for us to have some conversation within the classroom. So where the students in step 3, they present their identity boxes to their classmates, they said it is appropriate for classmates to ask questions to seek more information at this time. And to me, that is so important because it shows that yes, I do have information in this box, but that's not the end all be all. I have more that I can share. And then as a student in that classroom, I might identify with another classmate that I have not identified with before. That's helping to build more classroom community. So I think that's really important too.
Okay, thank you. Yes, and this is just one of the great activities in this unit about judgment, and it is linked to their ELA standards. And then our last example is a high school example from Iroquois High School. They have some really exciting programs happening there. And one of them is called Accelerate to Graduate, where students who come to this country as immigrants, as refugees, are able to earn their high school diploma. And Donna Neary leads a team that engages students by making connections to cultural models. I think my favorite example that she sent, and there were so many, is a partnership with the Speed Art Museum that combines students' personal stories and technology. And students were challenged to find a painting or a piece of art in the permanent collection at the Speed that would help tell their story as an immigrant, which I thought was amazing because I don't know what your experiences have been with taking students to the Speed, but the permanent collection is not always that interesting to students of different grade levels. Definitely elementary, they're like, what? So I think that was a really powerful way to make that connection.
As we think about the Speed Art Museum, I actually took my 4-year-old there for his birthday, and I exposed him to an exhibit by Ebony G. Patterson, While the Dew is Still on the Roses. And as we think about identity and we think about what Donna Neary did with her immigrant students, this particular exhibit views African American males in a different light, with nature, flowers, almost kind of, I don't want to compare her work to Kehinde Wiley by any means. However, it's being able to, when you see a black man, you don't usually see, society has given you the thoughts of what you should think about a black man. But here you see different images of black men dressing and undressing, not in the way that you may think when you hear me say this. So I definitely suggest that people go and check it out because Ebony Patterson was Jamaican born. And so she has a different set of lenses that she's looking through. And for kids to even think about, what is this art saying? What is speaking to you through these pieces of art, the same way that she's doing with her immigrant students, but not only with your identity, but the identity of someone else.
But that goes back to a very important part in the structuring of this whole thing, is the inclusion and the centering of inquiry. Because when students aren't allowed to, or they're not given a space to ask questions, they're not given the opportunity to center their competency. They're not at the center of their culturally and globally competency. It's something then that's being directed from the teacher, and that's why oftentimes we see some polar opposites in regards to the type of work that attempts to show that their learners are globally and culturally competent. So again, it's when we are putting the students at the center and letting them be able to ask questions and come to their own conclusions, that's how we're really, again, building up that competency skill.
I think Kanita just started to answer our next question, so the rest of us can be thinking about it. I definitely want to thank all of our educators from Slaughter, from Ramsey, and from Iroquois who shared their work with us. These examples can be inspiration for others around the district and a springboard for deep conversations about how each of us fit into society and what that means. We recognize that we're still in the early phases of backpack implementation. And I think what Kenita was alluding to is that what we see a lot of around global and cultural competence is often a focus on the environment or recycling or raising funds for countries overseas, without making the connection to the individual student, to racial identity, to the communities that are around us and the issues that are pressing against our students and their communities here at home as well as globally. And there's kind of a disconnect there with our performance expectations and where we are right now. What would you all say might be contributing factors for this trend to kind of avoid race as part of the conversation?
I think a lot of times it is teachers are unsure or unwilling to have the conversations about race. And I also believe it's the messages that are given to us from birth until present day, that certain groups of people are certain ways or have certain ideals and so on and so forth. Even as I think about Africa, when I introduced my students to Africa and asked them what came to mind when they thought about Africa, and it was, people with no shoes, no food, skinny, big bellies, dirty, all of these negative things that people thought about Africa, that I had to introduce them to a Instagram series of Everyday Africa, where there are people that look just like you, right? And so identity is the big piece in the reasons why I believe teachers are not having those conversations, because of what they have been taught, and they're taking what they have been taught and sharing it with students, and then it's just like a circle. It just keeps going around and around. But that circle has to be, I'm ready to slice through it, because if we don't, we're just going to continue to perpetuate the same things that we have been for so long.
Mentioning identity reminds me that our previous podcast included information about how one develops their own racial identity within a largely white context. And so if we're not even providing opportunities for our students to see who they are in relation to the world, then they're not perhaps going to be able to interact with the world and relate to it, to be able to find causes that matter to them, and to truly foster that global competence, that cultural competence. It starts from within. You have to be confident about your own identity, and as teachers, we really need to push and find chances to give kids opportunity to really see themselves and recognize that there are differences that can be made, but how do we draw them to opportunities to make a difference that matters to the kid themselves? So we've really got to be prepared to navigate that.
And I also think that teachers are just afraid to make a mistake, which is understandable. However, in these times, we need allies. So if you are considering something, or if you have a question about something, please reach out to someone and have a conversation, because we don't want that to be where it stops. We don't want fear to kind of keep us living where we are. That's why we're in the situation that we are. So educators have to be brave, because if we're not being brave for our students, how are we making sure that they're getting the whole picture, the whole story? And we just have to get comfortable being uncomfortable.
I know we have talked about this graphic before that will be linked to the podcast. They're not too young to talk about race, but it's an important point that everyone needs to realize. Silence about race reinforces racism. And so sometimes It's because of our fear. It's because of our own discomfort. It's because we think it's better not to talk about race. And we're actually having the exact opposite effect. And research has shown by kindergarten, children show many of the same racial attitudes that adults in our culture hold. They have already learned to associate some groups with higher status than others. And on the flip side of that, explicit conversations with 5 to 7-year-olds about interracial friendship can dramatically improve their racial attitudes in as little as a single week. So what are we doing in our classrooms to disrupt bias, to fight against racism, and to help our students develop this global and cultural competence? So let's talk strategy. Because it's important that we recognize that we can't produce globally and culturally competent citizens who are unaware or unable to recognize the role of racial identity in society. At this point, many students do not have the vocabulary to have productive conversations about issues relating to race or the role racism plays in the issues facing local and global communities. How can these important conversations become embedded in what we do as educators in school?
So, if you listen to our podcast regularly, you know we love teaching tolerance. And earlier I mentioned the essential questions from teaching tolerance, but something else I really want to point out that we also talked about the last podcast was the grade level outcomes and scenarios. So the social justice standards from teaching tolerance, there are 4 different domains, and if you look at the grade level outcomes, it gives you a practical way to see how you can embed these outcomes into what you are already teaching. So I am just looking at the K through 2 grade level outcomes for identity. A couple of them are, I can feel good about myself without being mean or making other people feel bad. That's something that we can absolutely incorporate in what we're teaching. Another one that says, I can talk about interesting and healthy ways that some people who share my group identities live their lives. So how are we making connections between people? And then another one, I see that the way my family and I do things is both the same as and different from how other people do things, and I'm interested in both. So that right there, that duality of language is letting us know that we want our students to know that what they do in their households can be different, but there are also commonalities among other households. So looking at those grade level outcomes really help you pare down and see how can I put some of these along with what I'm already teaching to make that focus even more succinct.
I'm going to piggyback on Lamanda here. Sometimes it's helpful for us to do some preliminary work to consider what our vulnerabilities are that can limit our effectiveness, as well as to identify strengths that might help us lead open and honest dialogues. So teaching tolerance also has a difficult conversations self-assessment that kind of guides you through that process. And then a follow-up responding to strong emotions graphic organizer. So that way when things come up, you're prepared.
And I know that we are talking about identity, but also they're called social justice standards. So I wanted to point out one of the social justice standards from K through 2 that Lamanda alluded to with identity. And one of them was Justice 14. And it says, I know that life is easier for some people and harder for others, and the reasons for that are not always fair. If there's one thing that kids definitely understand, that is things that are unfair. And this is a way to be able to start to have the conversation about race and identity and all of those things, because kids are being exposed to it. I mean, kids as young as 4 and 5 know that they are different and how they're treated. There are kids in preschools that are being suspended from preschools, black and brown kids that are being suspended from preschools. And they recognize that they are different from the other kids in the classrooms and not seeing themselves in those spaces. So I think, it's important, too, to look at those justice standards so that then they can turn to action.
I think another time that it's really important to take a look at our teaching tolerance standards is in the teaching of history. And so particularly we've just passed the Thanksgiving season. When we think about the traditional narrative around Thanksgiving and Native Americans versus colonial perspective, we teach that in the United States traditionally with great bias, and we are not giving voice to those that have been oppressed through those events. And so another one under justice for 3 through 5 is that I know when people are treated unfairly, and I can give examples of prejudice, words, pictures, and rules. I know that words, behaviors, rules, and laws that treat people unfairly based on their group identities can cause real harm. So there's opportunity for these discussions to be integrated into what we're already doing. And another tool that we have in the teacher backpack is the Affirming Racial Equity tool, nicknamed the R tool. And that has a set of questions to give our teachers time to think about how are we asking students to take perspective? How are students being represented in their curriculum? And also thinking about that prejudice elimination that builds relationship. So I think that these two are very important tools that teachers can easily get their hands on, especially if they're not sure where to start.
And don't forget, you can capture that work on Twitter by hashtagging your examples of you engaging your learners with this work by using the hashtag RUJCPS. That's hashtag AREYOUJCPS.
So realizing that this can be uncomfortable for teachers, what is your number one recommendation to a teacher who is just not knowing where to start, realizing that they want to open the conversation and make this space in their classroom? What would you give them as your number one piece of advice?
Like some of my colleagues have already mentioned, is reflection, understanding how your bias and culture may have created and influenced your knowledge. So that is very hard. And as a reflecting about how many times you can see something that looks like you when you turn on the TV, or when you go in the store and make purchases for your hair, or makeup for your skin tone. But there is definitely hope, and I want to mention that our new Miss Universe is South Africa, and she did a beautiful job at the end talking about why her work is going to be important as we talk about being globally and culturally competent, that now girls can see that the standard of beauty is not just one way, but there are multiple standards of beauty.
So thank you for that, Shashray. And some other strategies were going to be linked to the podcast. It's almost time for us to go. But one other resource from Teaching Tolerance, Reading Diversity, it has a resource that's a one-pager that PLCs and individual teachers could use, and a more detailed model for our AICs, department chairs, and content leads. And it's really learning how to recognize windows and mirrors. It's an important skill. We had a few trainings on that last year, and if schools are interested in that, please reach out to your resource teacher. But text is one way where we can bring the conversation into the classroom with something that we're already comfortable with, which is books. There'll be a few more links on here thinking about how we use our advisory time. Teaching Tolerance has a resource called 20 Face-to-Face Advisories, and for elementary translation, that's morning meeting or closing meeting. So thinking about how you can bring those conversations in while you're building community in your classroom. Another fabulous outlet for students is writing, and Teaching Tolerance has a resource called Writing for Change. So wherever we are in the curriculum, there are ways that we can think about how we can help our students become globally and culturally competent. I definitely agree with what Rachel said earlier as far as self-reflection. And so there's a article that links to this as well called Dear White Teacher, Books Promoting Racial Literacy. And So You Want to Talk About Race is on that list in that article. And definitely starting with our own identity and helping our students to have vocabulary about their identities is a place to start, and then beginning to think about how we can incorporate diversity, action, and justice. Well, our time is up. We hope you've gotten some ideas to spark globally and culturally competent lessons for your students, so they will not only graduate prepared to contribute positively to a diverse society, but begin being the change they want to see right now.